All right, welcome everyone and good afternoon or good morning to those of you who are on the West Coast. We are very excited to kick off today's conversation, which will spotlight effective strategies for addressing common barriers to cultural intelligence. And we have an extremely valuable discussion planned for you today, but before we go ahead and get started, although I'm sure you're very eager for us to do so, I would like to take this opportunity to briefly review just a few quick notes regarding today's program. Now, to help us ensure that this is a successful and engaging experience, I'd like to ask that you take note of the following recommended rules of engagement. As you can see, this is not our typical webinar platform, so to ensure you have the best view of today's discussion, we do recommend adjusting your view so that you can see the active speaker window only. Now, to do so, you're going to go ahead and navigate to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and set your view options to speaker view. Now, upon joining us for today's discussion, you may have noticed that your audio lines have been muted. This is to help us ensure that we have the best audio quality possible for our presenters. So please be sure to keep your lines muted at all times, unless of course you've been called on or are actively participating in the discussion during our open discussion periods. Now, to that point, please also be sure to turn on your camera. We'll want to see you during those discussions. So of course, you're welcome to keep them off during the course of the presentation itself. But again, once we transition to our open discussion periods, we'd appreciate it if you turn on your cameras so that you can fully engage with our presenters and your colleagues. Another thing that will be very helpful for me as a moderator for today's discussion is updating your name in Zoom so that I can recognize you. So to do that, you'll go ahead and open up the Participants tab, click beside your name, and then select More, where you should see an option for Rename. We recommend typing in your full name and even possibly your organization like you see here in this example on this slide. Finally, during the moderated discussion periods, we'd like to ask that you use the raise hand feature to pose your questions or comments verbally to our presenters. Take a moment to locate that feature now. Depending on the version of Zoom you have, it may either be at the very bottom of your Zoom toolbar under the Reactions button, or you may need to open up the Participants tab to see that raise hand feature. Now, alternatively, if you'd like to engage with your colleagues throughout the course of today's discussion, we highly encourage use of the chat feature. So at any point in time, please feel free to submit any comments you may have or questions that you may like to pose to our presenters. For those of you who are joining us today in a group of, let's say, 3 or more, we'd like to ask that you take this opportunity to submit a quick note in the chat to let us know that you're participating in a group of that size. This will ultimately help us to facilitate our breakout discussions, which I'll introduce a bit later in today's program. Should you need any assistance at any point, feel free to let us know through the chat and a member of our team will do our best to assist you. Now, given the sensitive nature of these kinds of discussions, it's important that we do practice humility and compassion. Having said that, I'd just like to reiterate some of our basic ground rules. So during our time together, we certainly want to hear from you, and there will be many opportunities for you to participate in the discussion to share your thoughts. Now, our dialogue is intended to serve as a learning opportunity, so don't be afraid to ask questions. Remember, this is a safe space for everyone, and we're not here to debate or diminish anyone's points of views or perspectives. We value everyone's input, and we want to make sure that you all feel comfortable and empowered to share your diverse perspectives without any judgment. And since we are all here to learn, it's important that we listen with an open mind and be respectful of others' points of view. Now, with that in mind, I would also like to reiterate that today's discussion is being recorded and will be made publicly available to the community. So having said that, please be mindful of your commentary with respect to any personal comments you may wish to share. Now, during our time together, as I mentioned earlier, we will be utilizing the Mendometer tool to provide you with an opportunity to actively participate in the discussion and share your valuable insights. To submit your responses, you'll need to navigate to menti.com, and when prompted, you're going to go ahead and enter the code 63140249. Should you have any difficulties accessing the tool, please feel free to contact us directly through the Zoom chat. Now, for anyone interested in continuing education credits, we are happy to share that we will be offering CEs for your participation in today's program. Following the conclusion of today's discussion, you'll receive an email with detailed instructions on how to claim any of the credits that are outlined here on this slide. Having said that, even if you're not interested in CEs, we do highly recommend obtaining a certificate of attendance so that you can complete the post-evaluation for this program and provide us with your feedback. We certainly want to hear from you and hear your thoughts on today's discussion and would appreciate your inputs on topics for us to consider for future programs. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention before I go ahead and begin today's program is that today's discussion is intended to be a continuance of an important dialogue that we introduced last month as it relates to bridging cultural communication. During today's discussion, or rather during that discussion, we took the time to lay the groundwork for understanding diversity as it relates to certain terms and their definitions, as well as the importance of developing cultural humility. So if you missed that session on embracing cultural differences through cultural humility, we highly recommend watching it to ensure you have a clear understanding of the definitions, as they're absolutely critical to today's conversation. Now, it is available on demand and continuing education credits are available. So to access the recording, you'll simply navigate to our website at organdonationalliance.org. Now, having said all of that, I'd like to go ahead and get today's conversation started by introducing our panel. So we are once again thrilled to be joined by my former colleague and well-respected leader in the community, Hedi Aguiar, founding principal of Fundamental Roots. And I'm also honored to be joined today by my colleague, Glenn Matsuki, who serves as a program consultant here at the Alliance. Hedi and Glenn, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. So thank you for joining us. So Hedi, the last time we talked a lot about cultural humility. Would you say that this is a term that you prefer over cultural competence?
Yes, so thank you, Deanna, for having me back. I appreciate being here with everybody today. And thank you to everyone for making the time to join us in this important conversation. Deanna, to speak to your question of cultural humility versus cultural competence. So the concern I have, and I think a lot of people have, is when you hear the term competence, there is a connotation of mastery that comes with competence. And that adds a lot of pressure and to something that a lot of people already feel nervous about because of fear of offense and just wanting to handle these conversations well. And so my preference is to use cultural humility, because that is something I feel is a lot more attainable. And it's also a safer way of communicating with each other. As we talked about during our last session, culture is very complex. There's a lot involved in culture. It's not just about somebody who looks different or sounds different. As we identified, there are so many layers to culture, and every single person has their own culture. We're always in a cross-cultural conversation. And so I think just using the term cultural humility, where we let that other person be our teacher and we work on our own self-awareness, we spend time reflecting and looking at our own opportunities for growth. I think that's something that's a lot more realistic than trying to aim for that mastery that we might be perceiving with cultural competence.
So how would you define cultural intelligence?
So cultural intelligence is a term that's probably not as well known. Now I'm kind of curious to see how the audience feels about that term. So I think we have a little, this is the first opportunity to practice using that Mendometer, where you can rank how familiar you are with that term of cultural intelligence. It's also known as CQ. You know, emotional intelligence is EQ, cultural intelligence is CQ. So I'm curious to see how everybody feels about that term. All right, looks like we have some experts in the group here today. That's fantastic. All right, wonderful. So most of you are kind of indicating maybe not so familiar with it, or maybe just mildly familiar with it. And some of you feel very confident with the term cultural intelligence. So I'd like to review what cultural intelligence is. So Deanna, I think I'll switch over here and share my slide. So cultural intelligence actually has 4 components. One of the components is CQ action, so cultural intelligence action. This is our ability to flex ourselves verbally and non-verbally to convey respect towards the other person. So we're adjusting our communication style to meet the other person where they are, because if we do that, that helps to build trust. If we're able to gain their respect, show them respect, we can start building trust. CQ drive, cultural intelligence drive, is about the willingness to work with diverse cultures, with a diverse group of people. And the thing is, when we have a tendency to be drawn to people who think like us, And sometimes that can be a challenge, right? When you work with people who have a diverse way of thinking of things, and that really stretches us and can make us feel uncomfortable. But CQ drive is the willingness to do that and to overcome any kind of biases we may have towards that diversity, and really work through that, because we know that ultimately that diversity will lend itself for a much more holistic, wider, well-rounded view, much better outcomes in relationships. Now, CQ knowledge is the understanding that we do have cultural differences, that each person who has, you know, we all have our own culture, and that there are differences that we all have that forms the way we value things, the way we look at things, the way we make decisions, our practices. And sometimes those differences can be a little bit more hidden and a little less obvious. And so again, CQ knowledge is understanding that those differences exist, and also that we are able to start uncovering those hidden differences, and that we're willing again to work through that. And then CQ strategy is the ability to flex ourselves mentally. So to being able to being able to be open to new and integrative ideas. So to give you an example of that would be, let's say, we talk about Western and Eastern medicine. And let's say in the US, for example, and Europe, for example, we're very much ingrained in what we call Western medicine, where it's all about what does the science show, and the technologies and pharmaceuticals, etc. And Eastern medicine may be more of a different approach in terms of the energies in the body and herbal treatments, more natural approaches, acupuncture, etc. So an integrative idea would be, for example, are we willing to embrace integrating different forms of thinking of something that challenges us to think outside of what we're normally familiar with? So if you imagine cultural intelligence, if every single one of these components was applied, can you imagine the outcomes we would have and the relationships we would have? I mean, that's the world I want to live in. So that's what cultural intelligence is about. It's challenging, but it's amazing.
Absolutely. So, Hedi, how does one go about developing cultural intelligence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest key is to start with that cultural humility, recognizing I don't know everything, and being willing to learn, being willing to self-reflect, overcoming my own barriers. Now, a lot of people are looking for tools. How do I communicate more effectively? And those are important to have. That being said, I think the biggest challenge we have to talk about first is what we're going to talk about today, which is what are the barriers that get in the way? Because if you have all the tools in the world, but you have barriers in the way, you're not going to use those tools. And so that's why this conversation today, I think, is super important. Now, before we go kind of into those barriers and identify what are the common barriers that we can be facing and dealing with, I think we need to preface this conversation first about I often see, and I reviewed a lot of the questions that came in part of the registration process, but this is also very common kind of questions I get. How do I get others to get this? How do I get others to want to change? How do I get others to communicate more effectively? And I think one thing we have to remember is I cannot change anybody else. I know we like to sometimes think and wish we could control somebody else, but we really don't have any control over anybody else. The only person I can control is me. And so I think, and that goes back to that cultural humility, going back to where do I need to grow? Because the more effective I become at managing my own sphere of control, the more likely I can influence people around me, because hopefully I will gain their respect. Hopefully they will be inspired. Hopefully they'll be curious and want to learn more. And it becomes that kind of gradual infusion around to the people around me. Of course, you're never going to change everybody, but we can definitely have a huge influence if we work on ourselves. And the better we go on that journey, the more we explore that journey, we learn so much from that, that gives us so much more grace and understanding for each other. And I think that grace and humility is just going to go such a long way in positively influencing people around us. So let's talk about those barriers that I mentioned. So these are the most common barriers that we see in what stands in the way of us developing, communicating effectively cross-culturally, but gets in the way of us developing that cultural intelligence and that cultural humility. And maybe some of these are already jumping out at you. Anxiety can be a big one. Stereotypes and prejudices, language problems, nonverbal communication, ethnocentrism, and I'll tie in unconscious biases with that as well. And then assuming similarities or assuming differences. So I'd like to go through each one of these barriers if that's okay with you.
Certainly okay with me. I'd love to hear a little bit more about each of these. Would you mind maybe starting with anxiety?
Sure. I have a little anxiety right now myself. And by the way, folks, I want you to know, as I'm talking about this, I'm on this journey myself. I'm not perfect at this either. This is an ongoing journey. Developing these skills is not something you learn overnight. It's not something you learn over years. It's an ongoing part of our personal growth as we go through life. So please give yourself grace as well with all of that, and give me grace too if I mess up. All right, so the one thing with anxiety is we might be anxious because we don't want to offend, right? So I might be going into this talk going, man, I hope I don't say something that's going to offend somebody. We could be anxious because maybe we're concerned that we don't understand enough. We don't know enough about somebody else's culture. Maybe their culture intimidates us. There can be different reasons we become anxious. The problem is when anxiety is triggered, when we have a nervousness that's triggered, it actually does something physical to us. Our sympathetic nervous system, that's part of our nerve structure in our body, gets activated. It's a very primitive system. It doesn't recognize differences between real life threatening issues and things that make us nervous. All it does is it knows it's being triggered. And when it triggers, we go into this fight, flight, or freeze response. So then we have symptoms, right? An increased heart rate, increased breathing, maybe I get all sweaty, and there's all sorts of symptoms that different people have. And now all of my blood is rushing to my muscles to get ready to run or fight the situation. And this is all physiologically happening. And so consequently, now it's hard to think clearly. And now I'm fumbling over my words and I say the very thing I didn't want to say, or I'm stuttering, or whatever the case may be. So a couple of small quick tips of overcoming anxiety is become a student of that person. So ask them good, curious question. Can you tell me more? Or can you help me understand? And then while they're talking, you can take some deep breaths. As you take deep breaths in, deep breath in, long breath out, it starts to regulate that sympathetic nervous system back. You can use box breathing, which is breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds. What that does is it starts regulating that nervous system. It helps it to settle down, helps the blood to come back up to your brain so you can think a little bit more clearly. And as that person is talking, you can hear what they're saying. If you really tune in and listen to what they're saying, it helps you to pick up that conversation. And now you're focusing away from your feelings and focusing on what they're saying. And again, that helps anxiety to settle down. The other thing is, outside of the heat of the moment, it's really important to reflect on those moments that trigger anxiety and to be very honest with ourselves. Because if we just kind of move on to whatever we're dealing with next, and we're busy people, and so we tend to not spend as much time reflecting as we could be. And being honest with ourselves is challenging sometimes, but we have to be very honest and get really to the root of, why am I becoming anxious in these situations? What triggered me, and where is this coming from? Most of the time, anxiety is coming from unfounded fears of what may or may not happen. And most of the time, it doesn't happen that way as we thought or were worrying about. It may have come from one past bad experience that is now making us nervous about the future. It could be based on something I heard from somebody else. So it's not even fact to me. It's just something else somebody else experienced. And the thing is, if I start uncovering where this is coming from, now I start disempowering this underlying whatever it is that's causing it. And once I disempower it, I uncover it, it takes kind of, it starts helping me to be able to work through that and be able to realize, okay, that's not coming from a rational place. And let me treat each situation like it's a new situation. So that's very quickly, anxiety is one of those barriers for sure.
So the second barrier you listed is stereotypes and prejudices. Could you tell us more about it, expand upon that?
Yeah, so stereotypes is a big problem. Stereotypes is when we make a blanket statement about, we just make a statement about somebody, we kind of lump them in with a group of people. It's a real endpoint. It's an endpoint that you have no plans to change your mind about. You're not realizing, you're just making this statement and just assume it's true in fact and applies to them. Now, and prejudice obviously is even worse. Here you're assuming the worst in a sense already about anybody without even knowing any details or anything about them. Now, Deanna and Glenn, how do you think we can overcome stereotypes and prejudices?
I personally just think back to our last conversation and, you know, really just recognizing that everyone is unique. We're all individuals with unique perspectives. And so it's important that you acknowledge that fact and just meet that person where they are. So instead of generalizing and relying on stereotypes, which do generalize, whether it's by race or culture, et cetera, just focusing on that individual and meeting them where they are.
Yeah, great point.
And I think the individual, we all need to really work on, you know, consciously change our perception about different people's stereotypes. And I think we also need to take time to, you know, pause, reflect, to check ourselves.
Yes.
I think that's probably the most important thing. And in doing so, you probably will be able to change your perspectives about other people or groups. And for me, I always practice mindfulness. So before even before getting into that conversation or, you know, meeting a new individual, you know, I've been mindful about that, you know.
Yeah, that's really great advice. And I agree, stay in that, again, if you can stay in that place of humility, know that you don't know, especially when you're meeting somebody for the first time, you want to make sure that you recognize, I want to learn about this person and adopt that being flexible and curious kind of mindset versus assuming that they're part of a group that you are stereotyping and you're making this blanket statement. And also we have to stop these words from coming out of our mouth. The minute we say it, correct it, you know, catch it, and reframe it and recognize, okay, maybe that wasn't fair. Maybe that's not actually true here. So avoiding those blanket statements and staying in that place of curiosity and flexibility and being able to be humble about it. And the thing is with these stereotypes and prejudices, a lot of those we're more consciously aware, right? That we're judging people. And that's something, who likes to be on the receiving end of judging? I don't like to be judged. And so so I have to make sure I'm not doing it to other people either. So yeah, the other barrier is, I'm sorry, Glenn, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say it's also important to realize that having the anxiety about the situation is important. I mean, we don't want to become blasé about everything. That's where we make the errors. So you know, and make mistakes. So I think, you know, being mindful and using the anxiety positively to move forward, I think is important.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So the other barrier that we're also dealing with is language problems. So language problems can literally be, you know, a language barrier because that person speaks a different language to us. And one thing we have to keep in mind is with language problems, with language differences, is that idioms, syntaxes, use of vocabulary, grammar doesn't translate necessarily and doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. Even within the US in different regions, different things can mean, different terms can, or expressions may not have any meaning or can mean something completely different. And so that's a challenge, and that can be a barrier. And then also the other thing we do have to remember with language is that communication is driven by culture. How we communicate is something we learn by whomever raises us. Tact, respect, diplomacy, humor, all of that is culturally driven. And if we forget that, it's so easy to have misunderstandings. So a couple of ways to overcome that is to, one, especially in the professional environment and especially in the donation and transplantation world, where there is a unique language to the profession that you're in, is to avoid that professional jargon, right? And use simple English. And use professional interpreters, especially when somebody does not speak English as a first language. When somebody is nervous or in grief, they tend to prefer to revert to their emotional language, whatever language that is for them. And so it's helpful to them and kinder to them if you can use professional interpreters. And I realize that can bring its own set of challenges with it. And so I definitely would favor prepping those interpreters before bringing them into the conversation. But again, use as simple terminology as possible, even if English is their first language. They don't know the donation and transplantation language, and it's so easy for us to slip into that. And the other thing, a quick tip as well, is use more indirect communication. So for languages around the world, they have discourse patterns. So there's discourse patterns, which is about how we are expected to communicate our message. And when we learn English as a second language, we tend to translate that discourse pattern into the English language. And all of the discourse patterns in the world are much more indirect than the American use of the English language. And American use of English language is pretty direct. We might say, I need to talk to you about the next meeting. And then I deliver my message, and then I get back to my point. It's a pretty direct way of communicating in comparison to other languages. Now, that being said, you also have individuals' personality styles, even within the English language, who prefer more indirect communication. The reason it's safer to go that route is if you're very direct in your communication style, the person who's on the receiving end, if they prefer indirect communication, may perceive it as aggressive, and may shrink back and shut down. And so it's something we don't want to happen. And so starting more indirect is safer. And then if you notice a person prefers a more direct way of communicating, then you can adjust your communication and switch to a more direct form with them. So that's something else we need to keep in mind as a barrier as well. And so just, folks, we're just going through these very quickly because we're really limited on time, and we want to make sure you have enough time in the breakouts to discuss as well. So the next barrier is nonverbal communication. The thing with nonverbal codes, it's important to also remember that nonverbal codes are not the same in all cultures. So for example, eye contact, touch, proximity from person to person, how we kind of present ourselves physically. All of those things are not necessarily the same from culture to culture. You know, handshakes, for example, is not universal. And the problem is that we tend to interpret nonverbal communication through our own frame of reference. We go through what our expectations is of another person and how they should be carrying themselves nonverbally based on how we were raised and what we're familiar with. And again, that's where it's easy for misunderstandings to happen. So for example, in some cultures, lowering your eyes would be a sign of respect and humility, and making eye contact could be seen as being aggressive or defiant. And so that's just one example of nonverbal codes. I'm not a big fan of the trainings of, well, if somebody crosses their arms, they're closed off. If, you know, all of those kind of body language trainings, because the challenge with those trainings is it's not taking into consideration cultural differences. It also doesn't take into consideration the habits that we develop. And so I highly recommend kind of putting all of those things aside. If you've been through those types of trainings, keep them in the back of your mind, but just recognize and know that culturally it can be very, very different. And people do develop habits. So don't run with your interpretation. I tend to prefer to watch people shift in their body language. So if I'm communicating with them and I notice all of a sudden there's a shift in their body language, I might stop and say, what are your thoughts right now? You know, do you have any concerns about this? What are you thinking? What's happening here? How are you feeling about it? So that way I can kind of check in with them versus running with what I'm assuming in my head might be happening. And also, if I notice that person is maybe not acting the way I would act in nonverbal communication, to somewhat mirror them a little bit until I get to know them a little bit better and I can understand where they're coming from. So that would be another barrier. Another barrier as well to consider is ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is where you negatively judge somebody else's ethnicity based on your own ethnicity's expectations. And then added to that as well as unconscious biases, because I think a lot of that drives our ethnocentrism. Excuse me, dealing with a little allergies here. So the ethnocentrism is something, I actually want to show you unconscious biases here. Let me project my slide here for a second. So ethnocentrism, as I said, we're judging other people's culture based on our own. We think that our culture is the right and proper. Again, this can happen very subconsciously. We might not be aware of this. And the problem is, if this is happening subconsciously, it's hard to do something about it, right? Because we're just kind of doing us. And so just recognizing that this tends to happen gives us an opportunity to check ourselves. And there are different unconscious biases that can drive our assumptions that we're making and our interpretation of what we're seeing. So there's this term unconscious bias, which you've probably heard of. It's you also hear implicit bias, often used interchangeably, very similar. I just learned recently it's actually not exactly the same, but the outcomes are pretty much the same and it's pretty much lumped together. One is unconscious biases, the associations you're driving, and the implicit biases is the viewpoint and the opinions that you have about it. But it kind of goes hand in hand. And there are a lot of different unconscious biases. I keep learning about new ones that are out there, but I just want to introduce you to 10 different ones just to start having awareness of them. So there's an affinity bias, which is a like, also known as a like me bias, where we tend to favor people with similarities. This could be ethnicity-based, language-based, this could be profession-based. There's so many different affinities that we could have, but we favor people who have similarities. Halo effect is where you perceive one great thing about a person and it just kind of colors your entire perspective of them, and you don't, in your opinion of them, and there's no room for changing your mind or seeing anything balanced in that. And then on the opposite end, you have the horn effect. This is where you see something, one negative thing, and you get hung up on that and you cannot see anything else that's going on with that person or have any other opinion about them. Attribution bias is where you take people's achievements and put them on a pedestal. And again, you're biased about whatever they're saying or doing or believing because you admire whatever attributions they have. Now, some of these biases, by the way, might not be an issue for you, and others may be more predominant in you. So it's just something, I'm just mentioning these so you can maybe start picking up on, oh yeah, maybe that is something I do. Confirmation bias is where we have an idea about something, a preconceived idea, and we look for information to confirm our idea, and we're not open to seeing anything else that is being presented. Anchoring bias is where we hear one piece of information and we anchor in on that and we miss everything else that's being said or presented, and so consequently we miss the point. Beauty bias is where we favor attractive people. Conformity bias, this is a huge challenge in organizations. Conformity bias is where we take cues from other people. We hear something somebody else said and now we pick up on cues from them. I think this is probably a human issue because I think we tend to like to, especially when we're hearing things from people we like and we hang out with, it's very easy to pick up on that cues. We're social, we're relational people, right? So I think this is probably more of a human issue as well. But the problem is obviously with that is it can bias us in a negative way and lead us to act in a negative way that then ends up having poor outcomes. Contrast effect is where we constantly are comparing good to bad, and gender bias is where we favor male or female. And so this is just an introduction to some of the biases, common biases that you will find, and hopefully you started identifying maybe some of them. Now, Glenn and Deanna, how do you think we can overcome some of these unconscious biases in ethnocentrism?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly no expert, but I would certainly say maybe the first step is actually just learning about unconscious biases and the fact that they do exist, and acknowledging that we all probably have our own unconscious biases. And
Yes.
once we've taken that step, perhaps, from there we can work through those biases and overcoming them. And I would say, for me, what I try to do in some cases is once I realize that, oh, that was perhaps a biased thought or comment I made, I try to put myself in the other person's shoes and try to understand their perspective. And so with that understanding, maybe I can change that bias, with that understanding.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
For me, what I had done is kind of lifted the curtain of my life and honestly evaluate all parts of my life, really. And I found that, for example, my friends, they were pretty much ethnically similar, and we're all of one religion, and that sort of thing. Frankly, I think really what we really need to do is really step outside of our bubble and expand our experiences with other people, having meaningful interactions with people from diverse backgrounds. For me, that's been helping me through my learning process of DEI. I've been actively pushing back a lot of the assumptions I've had about people, and I've taken a tremendous amount of effort in educating myself in unconscious bias.
Yeah, that's a great tip, Glenn, to purposefully put yourself in situations where you're the outsider, you're the odd one out, can really challenge us, one, with humility, because we have no choice but to humble ourselves and figure out how to fit in. And two, to practice asking really good questions to learn, and it can really help diffuse a lot of those biases we may have. So that's a great challenge for everybody to consider taking on, joining or attending some type of group or festival that you would never even think to attend, right? And to just learn to become a student of the folks around you and the culture that you're in. The other thing as well is what I encourage you to do a little bit to Deanna's point is, one, acknowledge I have biases, I have unconscious biases, and I want to be on a journey to uncover them. Because once I uncover them, then I can do something about them. And I think the one thing a way to maybe start noticing them is to pay attention to how you're feeling. Symptoms that you might have, nervousness that's being triggered in you, fear that's being triggered in you, discomfort that's being triggered, or even very content, being very content and happy and comfortable. And when you have those feelings, it's ask, okay, why am I feeling this way? Where is it coming from? And then going back to the unconscious biases that exist and start recognizing, oh, there's a name for this. This is what it is. And now I can start looking at how I need to address it and course correct. And I think the problem is if we don't know what's happening, then it's hard to do anything about it. And so I do think that symptoms basically come along with that. And then the last barrier I just wanted to address very quickly is assumptions. You always hear people say, stop making assumptions. Well, technically that's not possible because that's how our brains function. I say it too, stop assuming, but really what we're trying to say is don't act on your assumptions. Assumptions is a normal way our brain handles information because there's too much coming at us, there's too many pieces of information coming at us, and so we have to organize that information into patterns in our brain. So it's impossible to stop making assumptions. The problem becomes when we act on our assumptions, and when that drives our interactions and our communication with others. So whether I assume somebody is similar to me based on their ethnicity, their religion, the language they speak, the profession they're in, whatever the case might be, or if I'm assuming they're totally different to me, either way, if that drives my interaction, that can get me into trouble. And so that's where we tend to then communicate because it tends to drive our communication, and we expect that the other person's understanding, and now all of a sudden we're having a misunderstanding and we're not quite sure how that happened. So the best thing is not to run with our assumptions, not to act on our assumptions, but to check what are the facts and to make sure that we ask a question so that we can know for sure, are our assumptions accurate, or where do I need to course correct my thought process? And partly why we make assumptions is because we like things to be predictable, right? We like to know what we're dealing with. And so we have to kind of become comfortable with becoming uncomfortable, be comfortable with ambiguity, and kind of keep that non-judgmental attitude. So we covered a lot. There's a lot more we could be talking about and spending full workshops on this, but we do want to give all of you an opportunity to kind of have a little bit more dialogue about this versus just listening to me the whole time. So Glenn, can you, actually before, as we're setting up for that, Deanna, we had one more Mendometer ranking. So we're gonna put up the barriers we just talked about and invite you to vote which barrier do you struggle with the most. And you could pick more than one. Now, as you're voting here, I encourage you to pick one of these barriers that you identified for yourself. Pick one and work on that one first, because it can be very overwhelming if you think about, oh man, I have a little bit of all of these, or I might have two and they just are so big. Take one of them and work on that one first, and start exploring what antidotes would work for you. Dig a little bit deeper, do a little bit of research on that, and then practice that. And once you feel like, okay, I have a better handle on this, then maybe start working on the next barrier, because working on ourselves is hard. It's a lot of work. It takes time. We have to give ourselves grace with that. All right. Thank you all for sharing your barriers here. So Glenn, I think we're going to go into breakout discussions.
That's correct. We're going to our first breakout discussion. So while you're in the breakout room, and Deanna will explain how this is going to work, but your task is to work on the following question. When you are interacting with patients or their families, whether you work on the donation or transplant side, what are some ways to remedy any of the barriers or unconscious biases that we discuss? As a group, perhaps you can pick one and think of ways to, one of the ways of remedies, and then think of ways in your action of how you will remedy this in your interaction with the family. Deanna?
Thanks, Glenn. So I'm going to go ahead and move all of you into your respective breakouts. We're going to try to keep these small groups so that it's more of an intimate discussion and really allows you all an opportunity to share your opinions and your insights. But one thing you'll also see, if you all are still logged into that Mentimeter tool, keep that open. And as you as a group discuss some potential antidotes or what have you, you'll go ahead and just submit them into the Mentimeter platform, and then we'll come back to the general session here and kind of review some of the insights that you all have shared in your respective breakouts.
Deanna, can we do a quick example? Could you put up that Mentimeter so I can show folks what we're looking for?
Sure.
So when you're in your breakout room, if you can just kind of list who you're talking about. You may, if you work with donor families, that might be your choice. If you work with transplant recipients and their families or potential transplant patients, that might be your choice in your group discussion. So we're kind of looking for you to just put in what you were talking about, transplant patient, donor family, etc. And then pick the barrier or the unconscious bias you were discussing, and then what kind of antidote did you come up with? How are you going to overcome those barriers in the future? And you can submit more than one within your group. But the Mentimeter is available to you. You just won't see the submissions while you're in your breakout room.
Perfect. So I'll go ahead and move everyone. Safe travels, and we'll see you back in about 5 minutes.
All right, we have some great submissions here. Hopefully you can see it on the screen too. Anxiety here, take a moment to breathe and calm yourself before starting the conversation. Be comfortable, don't absorb with uncomfortable, don't absorb anxieties and notions from third parties. That's a great one. Yes, selecting a quality interpreter. A couple of you said that on language barriers. That is definitely a challenging one. A former colleague of mine said he used to have the interpreters arrive a little early, and he would screen them first and make sure that he was on the same page with them. And if he didn't feel like they could get on the same page, he would ask for another one. Now, what else do I see here? Avoid using jargon as well. Often my biggest barrier is language, having a trusted interpreter. Okay, great. As a clinical operations manager, I work remote and find myself having unconscious bias because I can't physically see people I deal with. I rely on things being reported to me. So that is a great one. I can imagine there being a lot of unconscious and maybe even conscious biases with some people that you're interacting with. And so maybe a good way to overcome that is to ask good questions and not run with the assumptions that might be formulating. All right, so we're going to go into the next breakout very quickly, and we're going to flip this. Sometimes we focus a little bit on, when we talk about communicating more effectively in a cultural context, we think about patients and their families, but what about internally with your own colleagues, or with your superiors, or with external professional partners? We all have our own culture as well. We can have misunderstandings that can happen there as well. And unfortunately, sometimes those end up escalating to HR. So what kind of barriers and unconscious biases can we have internally with each other, and how can we overcome those? So we're gonna move you really quickly back into your breakout room, and then we'll bring you back. Same thing, if you can type in your answers on Mentimeter, that would be great. It's so nice to see people's faces today here. Thank you, everybody, in playing along with us and trying out this whole breakout concept and using the Mentimeter. Really appreciate you giving this a shot. I like your barrier. I work donation side, and often everyone I deal with, including myself, are tired and trying to take in a lot of information in a short amount of time. Strategy, direct and concise information while still being patient. Okay, great. I saw one that had about halo and horn bias here, concentrating on one attribute. I think somebody else submitted something similar, good or bad, and not seeing past that. Take a step back and evaluate the person for who they are and why you perceive them the way you do. I think that's excellent advice. Really good. Patience, explain that you are learning and ask if you can ask questions. I think that's a great piece of advice. So what we're going to do is actually, these submissions will be emailed to you in follow up to today's session, so you have everybody's submissions here. So thank you for participating in that. We have one more Mentimeter activity for you. And this is where we would like to ask you just to type in one word on the Mentimeter. What benefit do you see in acquiring cultural intelligence? If you don't have access to the Mentimeter, you're welcome to put it in the chat box as well. What benefit do you see in acquiring cultural intelligence? Imagine if we had cultural intelligence, what would be that benefit? Deanna, I'll take the submission on the chat and submit it on the Mentimeter here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, are you sharing the Mentimeter? Perfect. Nice. And we'll send that. I don't know, Corey, maybe we can put that on social media afterwards, the word cloud. Excellent. So we're at the top of the hour. You can continue to submit. If we can just go to the last slide, Deanna, or maybe I can share the last slide so folks can, oh, there we go. Glenn had actually shared that there is this project Implicit through Harvard where you can take a test for yourself. And Glenn, do you have that? Can you put that link into the chat box for the attendees?
Yes, I will.
All right, great. And then while Glenn is doing that, if we can go to the next slide, Deanna, just want to leave you with these parting thoughts. And I apologize that this was, we're kind of wrapping this up pretty quickly here. Just to leave you with these two words, just remember, show each other grace, be humble. Remember, we all have to learn, help each other learn. I know certainly I have a lot to learn as well. And so I thank you so much for your time and participation. Thank you everybody so much for making the time to be here and for contributing.
Thank you.